It's an age-old mystery that has gripped the world for more than a century. Jack the Ripper, the mysterious serial killer whose identity has long remained a mystery.
In the fall of 1888, London was terrified. Newspapers were filled with rumors, threatening letters, and rising fear as a mysterious killer hunted the streets of Whitechapel. No one ever learned who he was, but the name Jack the Ripper became impossible to forget. His crimes shocked Victorian society and exposed the darkness lurking beneath the city's surface. Here we examine the evidence behind the world's most infamous serial killer. Whitechapel's dark streets. Victorian London wasn't the elegant world of top hats and tea parties. Not in the East End, Whitechapel was where poverty crushed hope. Overcrowded tenements packed families into single rooms. Disease spread through contaminated water. Crime festered in every alley. Women sold their bodies to afford a night's lodging. A bed cost 4p. Most couldn't afford even that. They slept in doorways and under bridges. Desperation made them vulnerable. A killer recognized that vulnerability and exploited it with surgical precision. The streets were dark. Gas lamps provided only scattered pools of light. Police patrols were irregular. A man could commit murder in the early morning hours and disappear into the maze of narrow lanes before anyone noticed. The killer understood the geography. He knew when to strike and where to vanish. Violence wasn't unusual in Whitechapel. Fights broke out in pubs nightly. Domestic disputes spilled into the streets. But what began in August 1888 was different. The brutality was deliberate. The pattern was unmistakable. Something evil had come to the East End. As autumn fog rolled through London's poorest district, the hunt for history's most infamous killer was about to begin. Victim 1, Ann Nichols. Ann Nichols was 43 years old. Friends called her Polly. She had been married once and had 5 children. Alcohol destroyed her family. She drifted between workhouses and the streets. On August 30th, 1888, she was turned away from a lodging house for lacking the bed money. She told the deputy keeper not to worry, she would earn it somehow. She gestured to her new bonnet, trying to sound optimistic. Those were among her last words. At 3:40 a.m. on August 31st, cart driver Charles Cross walked down Bucks Row on his way to work. He noticed what looked like a tarpaulin lying in a gateway. He approached for a closer look. It wasn't a tarpaulin, it was a woman's body. Another man, Robert Paul, arrived moments later. Together, they examined the body in the darkness. They thought she might be unconscious from drink. Cross touched her face. It was still warm. They decided to find a policeman. Constable John Neal discovered the full horror minutes later. Nichols' throat had been cut so deeply it nearly severed her head. Her abdomen had been sliced open. A doctor later determined she had been dead approximately 30 minutes when found. The killer had worked quickly and quietly, mere yards from occupied buildings. The murder weapon appeared to be a long, bladed knife. The cuts showed some knowledge of anatomy. This wasn't a random stabbing. This was calculated butchery. One woman was dead, but the nightmare was only beginning. Victim 2, Annie Chapman. Annie Chapman was 47 years old. Like Nichols, she had fallen into poverty and prostitution. She suffered from chronic lung disease and malnutrition. On September 7th, 1888, she was seen in the kitchen of a lodging house at 35 Dorset Street. She was too ill and too broke to pay for her bed. The deputy told her to leave. Chapman asked him not to rent her bed to anyone else. She would be back with the money. She walked out into the darkness around 1:30 a.m. At 6 a.m., John Davis, an elderly resident of 29 Hanbury Street, went down to the backyard. He discovered Chapman's body lying against the fence. Her throat was cut, her abdomen was open, her intestines had been pulled out and placed over her shoulder, her uterus had been removed and taken away. Dr. George Baxter Phillips examined the body. He made a disturbing observation. The killer appeared to have anatomical knowledge. The organs were removed with some skill. This wasn't the work of a random madman slashing wildly. This was deliberate, methodical. The killer knew what he was looking for. The violence had escalated. The public began to panic. Police increased patrols in Whitechapel, but they were searching for a ghost. The killer was just getting started, and his darkest night was still to come. Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Ed Dowse. September 30th, 1888 became known as the night of the double event. 2 murders within 45 minutes, 2 different locations. The killer was accelerating. Elizabeth Stride was 44 years old. Originally from Sweden, she had lived in London for over 20 years. She was last seen alive at 12:35 a.m. on Berner Street, talking to a man with a mustache. At 1 a.m., Louis Diemschutz drove his cart into Dutfield's yard. His horse shied away from something in the darkness. Diemschutz climbed down and struck a match. He found Stride's body, blood still flowing from the cut across her throat. Her abdomen was untouched, no mutilations. The killer had been interrupted. Diemschutz's arrival had saved Stride from the fate of the previous victims, but it created a problem for the murderer. He hadn't finished his work. 45 minutes later, at 1:45 a.m., Police Constable Edward Watkins walked through Mitre Square during his patrol. The square had been empty at 1:30 a.m. Now, Catherine Eddowes lay dead in the corner. Eddowes was 46 years old. She had been released from a police cell at 1 a.m. after being detained for drunkenness. She had less than an hour left to live. The mutilations were severe. Her throat was cut. Her face was slashed, including cuts that removed part of her nose and earlobe. Her abdomen was ripped open. Her intestines were pulled out. Her uterus and left kidney were removed and taken. The killer had worked with incredible speed. The square was on a police patrol route. He had perhaps 15 minutes, yet he inflicted devastating damage. He took trophies. He demonstrated complete control despite the risk. Later that night, a piece of Eddowes' blood-stained apron was found on Goulston Street, nearly a mile east of Mitre Square, but above it, someone had written in chalk, "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." The message was photographed, then erased before daylight to prevent anti-Jewish riots. The location suggested the killer had fled east after the murder. It indicated where he might live, but police never found him. 2 women were dead. The killer had proven he could strike twice in one night and vanish without a trace. London descended into fear. The final victim would suffer the worst fate of all. Victim 5, Mary Jane Kelly. Mary Jane Kelly was different from the other victims of the Whitechapel murders in several important ways. She was younger than the rest, only about 25 years old, and many contemporaries described her as attractive and well-liked. Unlike the other women who lived largely on the streets or in shared lodging houses, Kelly had a room of her own. She rented a small, sparsely furnished space at 13 Miller's Court, a narrow courtyard located behind 26 Dorset Street, one of the poorest areas of Whitechapel. Despite having her own room, Kelly lived in extreme poverty. By early November 1888, she had fallen behind on her rent. On the evening of November 8th, she was seen drinking heavily in several local pubs. Witnesses later told police that she appeared intoxicated and was seen in the company of different men as the night went on. The last confirmed sighting of Kelly occurred at approximately 11:45 p.m. when she was seen returning to her room with a man. The following morning, November 9th, at around 10:45 a.m., the landlord sent his assistant, Thomas Bowyer, to collect the overdue rent. When Bowyer arrived at Miller's Court, he knocked on Kelly's door, but received no response. Concerned, he reached through a broken window pane, pushed aside the curtain, and looked inside the room. What Bowyer saw horrified him. He immediately ran to summon the police. Kelly's body lay on the bed, and the crime scene was later described by investigators as the work of a devil. Her throat had been cut deeply, her body had been opened, and her internal organs were removed and placed around the room. Some organs were missing entirely, believed to have been taken by the killer. Her face was so severely mutilated that it was almost unrecognizable. Unlike the previous murders, this killing took place indoors. The murderer had privacy and several uninterrupted hours with his victim. Medical examiners estimated that Kelly died sometime between 2 and 8 a.m. A neighbor later reported hearing a cry of murder around 4 a.m., but such cries were common in Whitechapel and were often ignored. Mary Jane Kelly's murder is widely considered the final confirmed killing, attributed to Jack the Ripper. After her death, the murders abruptly stopped. The killer may have died, been imprisoned for another crime, or left London entirely. His true identity was never discovered, and the mystery continues to fascinate and haunt historians more than a century later. The victims were buried, but the legend of Jack the Ripper was just being born. The letters. On September 27th, 1888, the Central News Agency received a disturbing letter written in red ink. The writer signed himself Jack the Ripper. In the message, he mocked the police and hinted that the crimes would continue. He used aggressive language and claimed responsibility for the attacks, presenting himself as untouchable and confident. At first, authorities believed the letter was a hoax. London newspapers frequently received fake confessions, especially during times of public fear. However, on October 1st, police decided to release the letter to the public, hoping someone might recognize the handwriting or provide useful information. Once published, the name Jack the Ripper spread rapidly through newspapers across Britain. The nickname captured public attention and quickly became permanent. Later that same day, another message arrived at the Central News Agency. This time it was a postcard, often called the Saucy Jackie postcard. It referred to a recent incident involving 2 victims and mentioned details that had not yet appeared in the press. The handwriting appeared similar to the earlier letter, and the timing raised new questions. Some wondered if these messages might truly be connected to the person responsible for the crimes. Today, most historians believe both the letter and the postcard were likely fakes, possibly written by someone connected to the press to increase newspaper sales. Still, one later message caused particular concern. On October 16th, George Lusk, the head of the Mile End Vigilance Committee, received a small package. The committee was made up of local citizens trying to protect their neighborhood. Inside the package was part of a preserved human organ, along with a short, unsettling note claiming it had come from one of the victims. One victim, Catherine Eddowes, was known to have lost an organ during the attack, which led to intense speculation. A doctor examined the item and confirmed it was human tissue preserved in alcohol. However, medical students at the time could easily obtain such materials, making it difficult to confirm its origin. It was likely another cruel trick. These letters fueled public fear and fascination. Newspapers eagerly printed every detail, and readers followed the story closely. The case became one of the earliest examples of a crime shaped by mass media, where mystery, fear, and attention fed into one another and helped create a lasting legend. Real or fake, the letters ensured Jack the Ripper would never be forgotten. Eyewitnesses and descriptions. Several witnesses reported seeing the victims with a man shortly before their deaths. The descriptions varied but shared common elements. The man was between 25 and 35 years old. He stood around 5 feet 5 inches to 5 feet 7 inches tall. He had a stocky build. He wore a dark overcoat and dark hat. Several witnesses mentioned a mustache. His complexion was described as fair. Scotland Yard created a profile. They believed the killer was perfectly sane, frighteningly normal, and yet capable of extraordinary cruelty. This was revolutionary thinking for the time. Most assumed such brutal crimes could only come from a raving lunatic, but the Ripper's ability to evade capture suggested intelligence and self-control. Police employed new investigative techniques. They used bloodhounds to track scents, though the dogs proved unreliable. They conducted door-to-door searches. They interviewed hundreds of suspects. They offered rewards for information. Nothing worked. The killer knew Whitechapel intimately. He struck when police patrols were lightest. He chose victims who were alone and vulnerable. He worked quickly. He left no usable evidence. He became invisible in the crowd of thousands who lived in those streets. The failure to catch him destroyed careers. The police commissioner and home secretary both resigned. The public lost faith in law enforcement. The killer had won. But who was he? Theories emerged immediately and continue to this day. The suspects, 8 men and 1 woman. Montague John Druitt topped the official suspect list. He was a barrister with family connections to medicine. He lived near Whitechapel and had expressed interest in surgery. His mother had gone insane, and Druitt feared he was following the same path. His own family labeled him sexually insane. On December 3rd, 1888, Druitt's body was found in the Thames River. He had been dead about 4 weeks. The timing aligned with the end of the Ripper murders. His family suspected him. Police considered him the most likely candidate, but no concrete evidence connected him to the crimes. Michael Ostrog was a Russian doctor and known criminal. He had spent time in asylums for homicidal tendencies. He had no strong alibi for the murder dates, but again, evidence was insufficient. He remained a suspect only because he couldn't be ruled out. Aaron Kosminski was a Polish-Jewish resident of Whitechapel. He spent most of his adult life in asylums from 1889 until his death in 1919. He was known to hate women, particularly prostitutes. His appearance matched witness descriptions. In recent years, Kosminski received renewed attention. A businessman named Russell Edwards claimed to have DNA evidence from a shawl supposedly found at a crime scene. A scientist, Dr. Jari Luhelainen, analyzed the DNA and declared a match to Kosminski's descendants. The claim fell apart under scrutiny. The DNA analysis contained errors. The Shaw's connection to the crimes couldn't be verified. The evidence was never peer-reviewed. Kosminski remains a suspect, but the DNA proof proved nothing. The Jill the Ripper theory suggested a female killer. Inspector Aberline, who led the investigation, reportedly considered this possibility. A midwife would have anatomical knowledge. Blood on her clothing would raise no suspicion after attending a birth. She could slip past police looking for a male suspect. The theory had one fatal flaw. Every eyewitness described seeing the victims with a man. Not one reported seeing a woman. The theory persists in popular culture but has no evidential support. Prince Albert Victor, Christian Edward became the center of wild conspiracy theories. The prince frequented the Whitechapel area. He contracted syphilis, which could lead to insanity. One theory claimed he fathered a child with a local woman, and Queen Victoria ordered a cover-up. Another suggested syphilis-induced madness drove him to murder. Royal aides supposedly covered his identity. The whole theory is regarded by serious researchers as nonsense. No substantial evidence supports it, but it makes for entertaining fiction. Walter Sickert was a painter obsessed with Jack the Ripper. Crime novelist Patricia Cornwell spent over £2 million investigating Sickert. She believed she found her man. Sickert painted scenes referencing the murders. One painting was titled Jack the Ripper's Bedroom. He allegedly dressed up as the Ripper. Some of his paintings appeared to mirror the positions of the victims' bodies. A paper expert found that 3 letters from Sickert and 2 Ripper letters were written on the same rare paper stock. Only 24 sheets of this paper existed. Cornwell argued this couldn't be coincidence. The problem was that none of the Ripper letters are confirmed authentic. Most were likely hoaxes. Sickert's paintings came years after the murders. His obsession with the case proved nothing except that he, like many others, was fascinated by the mystery. Joseph Barnett lived with Mary Jane Kelly, the final victim. He worked as a fish porter and knew the East End intimately. He was in love with Kelly and called her his wife. He hated that she worked as a prostitute and had supported her financially to keep her off the streets. Then Barnett lost his job. Kelly returned to prostitution. They fought about her bringing other prostitutes home. Barnett moved out 10 days before Kelly's murder. The theory goes that Barnett killed the other women to frighten Kelly into leaving the streets. When that didn't work and she returned to prostitution, after he lost his income, he killed her in a rage. Barnett was questioned for 4 hours. Police found nothing to hold him. He had no clear motive for the earlier murders. The theory remains speculation. Hundreds of other suspects have been named over the decades. Francis Tumblety, an American doctor who fled England after the murders. George Chapman, a barber surgeon, later convicted of poisoning 3 women. Even Lewis Carroll, author of Alice in Wonderland, has been suggested based on supposed coded messages in his writings. The truth is, we don't know. We may never know. The evidence has been lost, contaminated, or destroyed. The witnesses are long dead. The killer took his secret to the grave. The case remains unsolved, but the hunt for answers continues. Over a century has passed since Jack the Ripper vanished into London's fog. 5 women were brutally killed. Dozens of suspects were named. Countless theories emerged, but the killer was never caught. His identity remains one of history's greatest mysteries, a reminder that some questions may never find answers. Subscribe for more unsolved cases that continue to haunt us.